First of all, in your resume, you are described as a specialist on Cuba and Latin America, political history and economy. Could you tell us more what this means?
Well, my interest has always been in what we could call the challenge of development. So that is a question of how countries like Cuba, with the revolution of 1959, which set out to build a different economic system or encourage more participation and democracy, how they can go about achieving that in a global economy which is very much divided between the imperialist countries and those countries which have been underdeveloped through that relationship, that unequal relationship. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in how countries can go about finding the resources that they need to carry out the investment in infrastructure and in social welfare, education, development, and so on, and in endogenous development. These are very complex questions which have faced countries historically and which confront countries around the world today. My doctoral research has taken up work as a member of the Cuban government. So between 1959 and 1965, when he left Cuba, Che was the president of the National Bank of Cuba. He was the head of the Department of Industrialization and later the Minister of Industries. And he developed a unique system of economic management which was designed to deal with the problems confronted in that period, the shift of trade relations from the United States to the socialist bloc countries and all the difficulties implied by the imposition of the US blockade, different technologies used, global isolation. The US was ensuring that the rest of the Americas cut off relations with Cuba, and coping with that situation at the same time as carrying out a transition from a capitalist to a socialist system.
As we turn to our focus to Cuba itself, this weekend we saw history with President Obama and President Raul Castro having a meeting for the first time in almost more than 50 years. President Obama at the meeting said the US should not be imprisoned by the past. What do you make of this meeting?
Well, I think that Obama is trying to locate himself somehow outside the history of the United States relationship with Cuba specifically and with Latin America more broadly. So in other words, he is trying to claim discontinuity or trying to say, look, I'm not accountable for what is broadly recognized to be an abusive history, you know, a history of imperialist exploitation, of supporting dictatorships, and the massive human cost of that, of imposing economic systems which led to, you know, the lost decade of the 1980s when millions of Latin Americans were thrown into absolute poverty and so on. So Obama is making an attempt to close the door on the overt U.S. interference in Latin America, and he clearly believes in a different technique, a different tactic, we should say, or a different strategy in order to forward the U.S. interests. And that strategy is engagement. He's made very clear, actually, in relation to Cuba, that the objective of the administration's policy remains the same, and that is regime change and to undermine the Cuban Revolution, to move away from socialism. And to introduce the kind of political and economic system which most of the world has and which, you know, the US is the biggest banner waver for, a capitalist system and, capitalist democracy. So, I think that's what he's trying to do. Now, he's in an awkward position actually doing so, because this is not a new president who's just taken up the mantle. This is someone who is actually approaching the end of his second administration. So, I think he's lost a lot of credibility. There was a lot of expectation from Latin American leaders and social movements and so on, even in Cuba, when Obama became president. And I think that the years since he first took over the administration has seen a growing disillusionment. And, this was really exemplified by the recent deterioration in relations with Venezuela. So, I think, yeah.
Yeah, but do you think that the Panama meeting had gone some way in restoring some of his credibility?
Well, I think it was absolutely vital from the U.S. perspective. I mean, they are under a lot of pressure, both economic and political, to reverse their policy of isolation of Cuba. At the last Summit of the Americas in 2012, even the president of Colombia, who hosted the Summit of the Americas, who's no friend of Cuba, who's a very right-wing government, an ally of the United States, said in his final declaration, we insist that Cuba is no longer excluded from this Forum of the Americas. And several countries had threatened to boycott this summit in Panama if Cuba wasn't invited. So yes, it's a very big step forward. Yes, it's historically significant, and the measure has been met with jubilation, particularly by Cubans, who are really the people who have suffered from this antagonistic relationship. Mm-hmm. I think it's very important to point out that the relationship is asymmetrical. It's not as if Cuba and the U.S. have done each other as much damage. I mean, really, there's very little for the Cuban government to dismantle in terms of hostility towards the U.S. or aggression or impeding normalization of relations. The apparatus impeding normal relations is all really built up in the United States. With the economic attacks,
yes,
the financing by $20 million every year of an internal opposition movement. Mm-hmm. So there are massive obstacles, but the obstacles are really on the side of the United States administration, and the ball is very much in their court.
It was also, Dr. Yaffe, widely expected, one of the obstacles to be removed, the one of U.S. putting Cuba on a list of countries sponsoring terrorism. It was widely expected at the Panama meeting that Cuba would be removed from the list. It didn't happen, though. What do you think were the reasons for that?
Well, Obama has said clearly, look, this is not my decision. This is not something I can do unilaterally. All I can do is mandate the State Department to consider it, and they will make a recommendation to the White House, and that happened. So I think it's likely that Cuba will be shortly removed from the list of terrorist sponsors, which, it definitely should be. There is, if you read the annual report, the latest annual report from the United States, justifying Cuba's inclusion, it's extremely weak. I mean, they practically say the reasons that we had for putting Cuba on this list no longer exist. Mm-hmm. And when you consider as well that in the United States, and particularly in Miami, there are roaming free in the streets known terrorists who are responsible for numerous deaths in Cuba and in Latin America more broadly, and that the United States, is harboring. Most important among those is Luis Posada Carriles. He was formerly a CIA agent. He was involved in the Bay of Pigs. He has admitted, even to a New York Times journalist, that he was the mastermind between a series of bombs that were placed in hotels in 1997 in Havana, which ended with the death of one Italian tourist and could easily have caused the death of many more. He was also the mastermind behind the bombing of a civilian flight, a Cuban Airlines, in 1976. And that flight was carrying just under 80 people. including Cuba's junior fencing team that was flying back with gold medals from the Pan American Games.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Dr. Yaffe, but also internally there is already resistance to the removal of the blockade within the U.S. We have seen some of the, I believe the presidential candidate for the Republicans saying that this is something to do with President Obama trying to leave a legacy, a foreign policy legacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think yes. I mean, there's a lot of screaming opposition, we can say, from the really sort of hardcore Cuban American lobby in the United States, and they are saying in many different ways. They're saying, you know, in this negotiation, what is Cuba giving to the United States? Effectively, Obama is giving Cuba everything it's asking for and getting nothing in return. Well, I'll go back to my previous point that, you know, it was an asymmetrical relationship. It is the United States that has so much it needs to remove in terms of normalizing relationships. But yes, the question is, does this very sort of extreme position among the Cuban American political representatives, does it have the power to block any further progress towards the normalization of relations, to removing the blockade or the embargo? That's the question. And it's clear from surveys that have been carried out that the tide has changed, the tide has turned, and that actually the majority of Cubans in Florida are now in favor of normalizing relations, removing the U.S. blockade, removing restrictions on their freedom to travel home and to go and see their families and to send money and so on. So I think we saw this even in the previous election of Obama. He won in Florida, where normally, because of the hold that the Cuban Americans have on politics in that area, you know, they have managed to turn the issue of Cuba into domestic policy, not foreign policy, but domestic policy. So it does look as if their political leverage is weakening. And Obama, who is a very calculated operator, has obviously decided that the political cost of going ahead with this process of normalization with Cuba is actually less now than the economic and political advantages to the administration. So in other words, he feels that he can outmaneuver this Cuban American lobby and their resistance.
Yes, Dr. Yaffe, thank you so much for this fascinating insight.